You've got 10 seconds to decide whether this old man walks out of that door breathing. That's what Ryan Cole said, grinning ear to ear, planted in the entrance of a diner that had fed this town for 3 decades. Behind him, 3 of his men pinned a shaking young waitress against the counter, and Walter Briggs, 67 years old, apron still knotted around his waist, spatula still gripped in one withered hand, didn't flinch, didn't blink, didn't say a word. He simply studied Ryan Cole, the way a sailor studies a storm cloud he's already outlasted 100 times before. Before we dive deeper, hit that subscribe button and stick with me to the end, because what unfolds inside this small town diner is going to completely rewrite how you look at quiet old men who never raise their voices. And if you're watching right now, drop a comment telling me what city you're tuning in from. I read everyone, and I want to see exactly how far this story has traveled. Now let's rewind to where it all started. Millbrook, Ohio wasn't the kind of place that showed up on a map unless you already knew exactly where to look. A single gas station, a hardware store that had passed down through one family since the Eisenhower years, a Baptist church whose bell rang just slightly out of tune, and right at the intersection of Route 9 and Miller Lane sat a diner with a faded red sign reading Briggs Place, its paint peeling at the corners from 20 winters of Ohio cold. Every morning, before the sun had even cleared the tree line, the lights inside that diner would blink to life, and the aroma of fresh coffee and sizzling bacon would spill out into the chill. Anyone passing by at that hour would witness the same scene they'd watched unfold for more than 2 decades. Walter Briggs behind that counter, sleeves shoved up past his elbows, moving through his morning ritual like a man who'd done it 10,000 times already and planned on doing it 10,000 more. He wasn't imposing, not the sort of man who filled a doorway or silenced a room the second he walked in. Medium build, a slight stoop that age had given him, grey hair trimmed short and tidy, his face carved with the kind of lines that come from squinting into decades of sun and wind. But his hands told a different story, thick-knuckled, scarred across the back, the hands of someone who'd done real work, the kind that leaves permanent marks on a body, whether the man wants it to or not. Morning, Walter, old Frank Delaney said, settling onto the same stool he'd claimed every single morning for longer than most folks could remember. Coffee's not going to pour itself, you know. Give it a minute, Frank, Walter answered, eyes still on the griddle. 22 years, you've been coming in here, and you still think rushing me speeds anything up. Worth trying every time. A couple of the regulars chuckled at that. This was the heartbeat of the place. Familiar, warm, unbothered by time. Emily Carter wove between tables, coffee pot in one hand, notepad in the other. 24, dark hair pulled back into a ponytail, with the kind of easy smile that made strangers feel like old friends within minutes. You're humming again, she said, ducking behind the counter to grab a stack of clean mugs. Didn't realize I was. You always hum when the bacon comes out just right. It's basically your happy noise. Walter allowed himself the faintest twitch of a smile, the kind that barely moved his lips, but somehow still reached his eyes. Careful, Emily. People start thinking an old man's gone soft. Next thing you know, they stop tipping. Everybody already knows you're soft, Walter. You fed Danny Coleman breakfast for free every single day last winter, or his dad lost his job, and you never told a soul. Not until his mama came in here crying to thank you. That was a business decision, Walter said flatly, and Emily laughed, because they both knew that wasn't true, and that was exactly why she loved working there. This was Millbrook. This was Walter Briggs, or at least the version of him the town believed it knew. A widower, a veteran, a man who kept his distance outside diner hours, fixed his own truck, tended a modest vegetable patch behind his house, nodded politely at Sunday service, but never lingered long after it. Ended, gentle, quiet, predictable, but there were small details, the kind you'd only catch if you were paying close attention, that didn't quite match the picture. Like how Walter always sat with his back against the wall in his own restaurant, angled just so he could watch both the front door and the parking lot at once. Like the way his gaze never really settled, not nervous, not paranoid, just constantly scanning, constantly logging. The way a man checks the exits in any room, without even realizing he's still doing it, because the habit had long since become as automatic as breathing, or how, whenever an unfamiliar truck rolled into the lot, Walter's hands would freeze for the briefest fraction of a second before resuming whatever task they'd been in the middle of. A pause so quick that in 20 years, not a single person in Millbrook had ever caught it, let alone asked him about it. Emily hadn't caught it either. Not really. She noticed things about Walter the way you notice things about a grandfather. Small habits, gentle mysteries that never seemed to need explaining. "Can I ask you something?" she said one lazy afternoon, wiping down the counter while Walter restocked napkin holders. "You can ask. Doesn't mean I'll answer." "Fair," she smiled. "Do you ever miss it? Before all this, before the diner, you were in the service, right? What did you do after you got out?" Walter's hands paused on the dispenser for just a beat. Then they kept moving, unbothered, his voice level. "I did a lot of things, Emily. Most of them aren't worth talking about." "That's not really an answer. It's the only one you're getting." She let it drop, because that was always how it went with Walter, polite, but unmovable whenever a question drifted anywhere close to his past. She'd learned long ago not to push. Some people carried stories they didn't want dragged back into daylight, and Emily respected that, the same way she respected the fact that Walter had hired her when nobody else in town would take a chance on a young single mother. No questions, no judgment, just a simple, "Can you start Monday?" What Emily didn't know, what nobody in Millbrook truly knew, was that the man pouring coffee behind that counter had once been an entirely different person. Someone whose name, decades ago, in far-off states, and a completely different life, had made grown men lower their voices. Walter Briggs hadn't always run a diner. He had once been something else, something the world had worked hard to forget, and that he had worked even harder to bury. But some things refused to stay buried. Some things simply wait. Asterisk asterisk to asterisk asterisk. The first crack in Millbrook's com arrived on a Tuesday morning in early spring, when Sheriff Tom Reyes walked into the diner looking like a man who hadn't slept in days. "Coffee, Tom?" Walter asked, already reaching for the pot. "Black, and keep it coming." Reyes dropped onto a stool, rubbing his eyes. "You catch wind of what happened out at the Hendricks place?" Walter's expression didn't shift, but something behind his eyes sharpened. "Heard something about a break-in." "Wasn't a break-in." "Not really." Reyes lowered his voice. Even though the diner sat mostly empty, 3 men showed up at Carl Hendricks' hardware store yesterday, told him he needed to start paying for protection. When Carl told them to shove off, they wrecked half his inventory and put him in the hospital with a broken wrist. Protection from what? That's the question, isn't it? Ray shook his head. New crews been rolling through the county, calling themselves the Black Vipers. Young, aggressive, mostly. Hit a diner over in Prescott last month. A gas station in Delford the month before. Word is they're moving town to town along the interstate, squeezing every small business owner who can't afford lawyers or private security. And you can't stop them. I've got 4 deputies covering 400 square miles. Walter. By the time we answer one call, they've already rolled on to the next town. Reyes took a long pull of his coffee. I'm not telling you this to spook you. I'm telling you because Millbrook's exactly the kind of town they go after. Small, quiet, no real police presence. He gestured around the busy little diner. And this place is exactly the kind of target they love. Successful, well-liked owner. Nobody expecting trouble. Walter wiped the counter down, slow and methodical, his face giving nothing away. Appreciate the heads up, Tom. I mean it. Anybody gives you grief in here, you call me straight away. Don't try handling it yourself. You're not a young man anymore. Something flickered behind Walter's eyes, something that might have passed for amusement, if you knew him well enough to spot it, which almost no one in Millbrook did. I'll keep that in mind, he said. Reyes finished his coffee, dropped a 5 on the counter, despite Walter's protest, and stepped out into the grey. Morning, unaware he'd just handed a warning to a man who'd faced down far worse than a handful of loud-mouthed 20-somethings in leather. Emily had been listening from the kitchen doorway, and once Ray's left, she came out with worrying etched across her face. Walter, that sounds serious. Maybe we should think about what? I don't know. Better locks, cameras, something. Walter set down his rag and looked at her, and something in that gaze made her stop mid-sentence. Not harsh, just final. The kind of look that closed conversations instead of opening them. This diner's stood for 30 years. It's not going anywhere. That's not really comforting, given what the sheriff just said. It's the only comfort I've got. He picked the rag back up. You gonna help me get ready for lunch rush, or stand there worrying about things that haven't happened? Emily sighed, but couldn't help smiling despite herself. That was Walter, steady as bedrock, unshakable in a way that felt old-fashioned and reassuring even when maybe it shouldn't have been. She went back to work. Lunch rush came and went like always. Familiar faces, familiar orders, and by the time the sun dipped low, Ray's warning had faded into background static, the way warnings usually do, right up until the moment they stop being warnings and start being reality. **3**3 days slipped by without incident. The diner kept its rhythm. Mornings full of coffee and gossip. Afternoons slower. Evenings winding down as regulars drifted home. Walter kept working, kept humming when the bacon crisped just right, kept giving Emily that steady presence she'd come to lean on more than she probably should have, given he was her boss and not her family, even if it often felt that way. Then, on a Thursday morning, everything shifted. It began with the growl of motorcycles. Emily heard it first, a low, aggressive rumble building fast, multiple engines closing in, the kind of sound that raises the hair on your neck before your brain even catches up to why. She looked up from a table she'd been clearing just in time to watch 3 motorcycles roar into the parking lot, tires spraying gravel as they skidded to deliberately dramatic stops. 3 men climbed off, mid-20s at most, black leather jackets stamped with a patch Emily didn't recognize, a snake coiled around a knife. They swaggered toward the door with the loose, cocky confidence of men who'd never once faced a consequence they couldn't just walk away from. The bell jingled as they shoved inside, and the diner, normally alive with easy chatter, dropped into a silence so sudden it felt physical. Walter didn't stop what he was doing. He kept wiping a plate, unhurried, his eyes flicking toward the 3 men once before returning to his work. The one in front, tall, lean, shaved head, a face locked into a permanent sneer, walked straight to the counter and slammed his palm down hard enough to rattle the napkin dispenser. "You the owner?" "That's right," Walter said, setting the plate down. "Name's Marcus. My boss wants a word with you about how business runs around here now." He glanced around the room, at the frightened customers, at Emily frozen near the kitchen door. "Real nice little place you've got. Shame if something happened to it. Appreciate the concern," Walter said. "But we don't have much to discuss." Marcus's sneer deepened. He nodded to the others, and one of them, thick-armed, half-finished tattoos crawling up to his shoulders, swept an entire tray of dishes off the nearest table, sending them shattering across the floor. Somebody screamed. A woman by the window yanked her child close. $2,000 a month, Marcus said, turning back to Walter, his voice flat as a business memo, despite the wreckage around him. "That's the cost of keeping your little place standing. You pay. Nothing bad happens here. You don't pay." He waved lazily at the broken plates. "Well, you're already getting a sample." Walter's expression didn't so much as twitch. "I think you boys should leave," he said. Quiet, the third man, younger and twitchier than the other 2, hungry to prove himself, laughed and grabbed the first thing within reach. Emily's arm as she tried slipping past him toward the kitchen phone. "Where you headed, sweetheart?" he said, yanking her back hard enough to make her stumble, catching herself against the counter with a sharp gasp of pain. And that was the exact moment everything in that diner changed. Walter set his rag down. It was a small, unremarkable motion. But the moment his hand left that fabric, something in the air shifted. Emily felt it even through her fear, even with her arm throbbing where she'd been grabbed. Though she couldn't have named what it was, Walter's eyes had gone completely still. The gentle warmth that usually lived there had drained out entirely, replaced with something clinical, almost calculating. "Let go of her," he said. His voice hadn't risen a single decibel. If anything, it had gone quieter. The young man laughed again, tightening his grip. Or what? Old. He never got to finish. What happened next lasted under 4 seconds, and every soul in that diner would spend the rest of their lives trying to describe it. And none of them would ever quite manage, because it moved too fast, too clean, too precise for the human eye to fully track in real time. Walter didn't lunge, didn't charge. He moved the way water moves around a rock in a stream. Fluid, efficient, not a single wasted motion. His hand closed around the young man's wrist. There was a sharp crack. The man screamed, "Let Emily go," and staggered backward, clutching his hand to his chest. Marcus surged forward with a shout, swinging a fist toward Walter's skull. And somehow, impossibly, Walter simply wasn't there anymore. He'd shifted half a step sideways, and his open palm caught Marcus square in the chest, with a sound like a slamming car door. Marcus flew backward into a table, which folded beneath him, had a burst of splintered wood. The thick-armed man came next, roaring, grabbing at Walter's shoulders, and Walter dropped low, drove his shoulder into the man's gut, and used the man's own momentum to launch him through the front door in an explosion of glass. The bell above the frame rang wildly as it clattered to the floor. And then it was finished. 3 grown men, young, strong, trained in exactly the sort of casual street violence that terrorizes small towns like Millbrook, all 3 of them groaning on the ground, one clutching a shattered wrist, one gasping on top of a collapsed table, one lying half in, half out of the shattered doorway. Walter stood right where he'd been the entire time, breathing normally, his expression as flat and unreadable as before any of it started. Nobody spoke. The silence held, broken only by the whimpering of the young man cradling his wrist. Emily stared at him, mouth open, arm still aching, unable to process what she'd just witnessed. This was Walter, sweet, quiet, hums when the bacon's crispy Walter, the man who gave free breakfasts to struggling families, never raised his voice, always seemed a shade too gentle for the world he lived in. And he had just dismantled 3 men in under 5 seconds without breaking a sweat. "Walter," she whispered. Double quotes, "Yes, Emily." His voice had softened again, almost apologetic, the ice vanishing from his eyes as quickly as it had appeared. "Could you call Sheriff Reyes for me? Tell him we had some trouble." She stared at him a beat longer, then nodded numbly and moved for the kitchen phone, hands shaking as she dialed. Marcus, still gasping on the floor amid the wreckage, lifted his head and glared at Walter with pure hatred. "You're dead," he wheezed. "You have no idea who you just crossed, old man. My boss is gonna hear about this. You're finished. You and your whole. Get out of my diner," Walter said quietly, and something in his tone silenced even Marcus. The 3 men crawled and limped their way back to their bikes, the young one cradling his ruined wrist, the heavy one bleeding from a gash along his forehead, Marcus glaring back the whole way, promising revenge with his eyes even as his mouth stayed shut. They tore out of the lot moments later, gravel flying, engines screaming with wounded fury. Sheriff Reyes arrived 20 minutes later to find a diner full of rattled customers, a shattered front door, broken tables and dishes scattered everywhere, and Walter Briggs calmly sweeping up glass, as though nothing out of the ordinary had happened at all. Walter, Reyes stood in the doorway, staring at the wreckage, then at Walter, then back at the wreckage. "What in God's name happened here?" "Had some trouble with a few young men," Walter said, not looking up from his sweeping. They left. Reyes scanned the room, the broken door, the collapsed table, the scattered dishes. Several customers talked over each other, trying to describe what they'd seen, voices pitched high with disbelief. Reyes held up a hand for quiet, then turned back to Walter, with an expression somewhere between shock and dawning concern. Someone said you took down 3 men by yourself. Someone said it happened in under 5 seconds. Walter finally looked up, meeting the sheriff's eyes with something like mild, bored patience. People exaggerate when they're scared, Tom. Emily didn't seem to be exaggerating. Ray's glanced toward the kitchen doorway, where Emily stood pale, arms wrapped around herself, watching the exchange in silence. She says you moved faster than anything she's ever seen. Says it didn't even look real. I used to know how to handle myself, Walter said simply. Long time ago. Ray's lowered his voice, stepping closer, his tone shifting from official to personal. I've known you 15 years, Walter. Never once heard you raise your voice at anybody. And you're telling me you just took down 3 members of the Black Vipers, a gang that's put grown men in the hospital, without breaking a sweat. Walter set his broom down and looked at the sheriff for a long moment, and something old and tired and heavy with unspoken things passed behind his eyes. Some skills don't fade, Tom. No matter how long you spend trying to forget them. Ray studied him carefully, and for the first time in 15 years of friendship, found himself looking at Walter Briggs and genuinely wondering who this man actually was. You want to tell me where you learned to fight like that? No, Walter said. I don't. And that was the end of that, for now. Ray's recognized a closed door when he saw one, and let it go, focusing instead on taking statements and assessing the damage. But as he worked, his mind kept circling back to the strange, unreadable calm on Walter's face, and to a growing, uneasy certainty that Walter Briggs carried a past none of them in Millbrook had ever come close to understanding. That evening, after the diner closed and the last of the glass had been swept up and the door boarded over with plywood until a repairman could come, Emily lingered in the parking lot instead of heading home. Walter was locking up, moving through his usual routine, though the afternoon's violence hadn't touched him at all. Emily found herself watching him with new eyes, hunting his familiar face for some trace of the man who'd moved like a blur just hours before. Walter, she said finally, I need to ask you something, and I need you to actually answer this time. He paused, key still in the lock, and looked at her. Who are you? Her voice trembled slightly, not from fear of him, but from the sheer strangeness of asking someone she'd known for 2 years who they really were. I mean it, because the man who did that today, that wasn't the guy who's been giving me shifts and asking about my daughter and humming over the bacon for 2 years. That was someone else entirely. Walter was quiet a long moment, eyes distant, fixed on something far beyond the parking lot, far beyond Millbrook itself. I was a lot of things before I was this, he said finally, gesturing vaguely at the diner, at his apron still tied around his waist. Some of it I'm not proud of. Some of it I try very hard not to think about. But you were involved with something dangerous, Emily. He looked at her directly now, and his eyes carried a weariness she'd never seen in him before, old in a way that had nothing to do with his actual age. There are things from my past I buried a long time ago, because I wanted a different life, a quiet one. This diner, this town, this is the life I chose after everything else. After what, though? What happened? He shook his head slowly. Not tonight. Maybe not ever. Some things are better left where they are. Those men said their boss was going to hear about this, Emily said, her voice tightening. They said you had no idea who you'd mess with. What if they come back? What if they bring more men? Walter's expression hardened slightly, and for just a beat, that same cold, calculating look from earlier flickered behind his eyes. Let them come back, he said quietly. Walter, that's not Emily. His voice softened again, and he reached out, resting a steady hand on her shoulder. The same gesture he'd used 100 times before, to steady her through hard shifts, hard customers, hard days. I need you to trust me on this. Whatever happens next, I need you to trust that I know exactly what I'm doing. Can you do that? She searched his face for reassurance and found something both comforting and deeply unsettling. A steadiness that felt less like the confidence of a diner owner and more like the confidence of a man who'd faced down far greater threats than 3 young men in leather jackets, and walked away from every single one. "Okay," she said finally, though her voice still trembled. "I trust you. Good." He squeezed her shoulder gently, then let go, turning back to lock the door. "Now go home. Get some rest. Kiss your girl goodnight for me." Emily nodded and turned toward her car, but paused a few steps out and looked back. "Walter, those men mentioned a boss. Someone who was going to hear about this. Do you have any idea who they meant?" Walter's hands stilled on the lock for a moment. When he answered, his voice had gone quiet, almost distant, like he was speaking more to himself than to her. "I have some idea," he said. "I hope I'm wrong." He didn't say more, and Emily didn't push, though the words settled into her chest like a stone, heavy, unresolved. She drove home with the radio off, replaying the afternoon's violence over and over. And beneath the fear, beneath the confusion, she found herself wondering, for the first time in 2 years of knowing him, exactly who Walter Briggs had been before he became the gentle diner owner she thought she knew. ****, 3 counties away. In a garage behind a rundown bar, on the edge of Prescott, Ryan Cole sat behind a scarred metal desk, listening to Marcus recount what had happened at Briggs' place, his fury climbing with every word. Ryan Cole, 34, built like a man who spent his free time in a weight room other than a bar, had cold blue eyes and a jaw that never seemed to fully unclench. Over the past 3 years, he'd built the Black Vipers from nothing, a loose collection of angry young men drawn to power, and finding it in fear. 3 of you, Ryan said slowly, once Marcus had finished. 3 of you against a 67-year-old diner cook, and he put all 3 of you on the ground in under 5 seconds. You had to see it, boss, Marcus said, cradling his splintered wrist. It wasn't normal. Wasn't like fighting some regular guy. It was like fighting someone who'd actually been trained for it. Really trained. Military, maybe. Maybe more than that. Ryan leaned back, studying Marcus's battered face, the splint, the stitches along the other man's forehead standing in the corner of the garage. What's his name again? Walter Briggs. Ryan turned to the man seated at the computer, a quiet, unassuming figure named Danny, who handled research and background checks, the kind of work that called for patience and a keyboard rather than fists. Danny, pull everything you can find on a Walter Briggs, Millbrook, Ohio, military records, if you can get them. I want to know exactly who put 3 of my men in the hospital. Danny nodded and got to work, fingers flying across the keyboard, digging through public records and old newspaper archives, hunting for anything that might explain the mystery of Walter Briggs. Nearly 2 hours passed before he finally looked up, his face gone pale. "Boss," he said quietly, "you need to see this." Ryan crossed the garage and leaned over Danny's shoulder. An old newspaper clipping, grainy and yellowed with age, showed a photograph of a much younger man standing beside a motorcycle, his face harder, leaner, colder than the gentle diner owner Marcus had described. Above the image, a headline that made Ryan's blood run cold before he'd even finished reading it. He stared at the screen for a long moment, jaw tightening, a cold certainty settling into his chest that he'd made a serious mistake sending 3 of his men into that diner without knowing exactly who they'd be facing. "Boss," Marcus said, watching his face, "what is it? What did you find?" Ryan straightened slowly, eyes still fixed on that old photograph, on the face of a man who had once been something far more dangerous than a diner owner, something that made even hardened criminals lower their voices when they spoke his name. "Get everyone together," Ryan said quietly. "Tonight. All of them. Why? What did you find?" Ryan turned to face his men, and for the first time any of them could remember, something close to uncertainty crossed his face. "We didn't just shake down some old man today," he said slowly. "We poked a monster that's been asleep for 20 years. Now we need to figure out exactly how bad this gets before he wakes all the way up." Back in Millbrook, Walter Briggs sat alone in his small quiet house that night, staring down at an old steel box on the table in front of him, a box he hadn't opened in over 15 years. his hand hovering above the latch as old memories, memories he'd worked so hard to bury, began clawing their way back to the surface. The box sat untouched for 11 more minutes before Walter finally pulled his hand away. He wasn't ready. Maybe never would be. He pushed back from the table, stood, and walked to the window instead, staring out at the dark, empty street where nothing moved except the flutter of a moth against the porch light. Millbrook slept the way it always slept, peaceful, unaware, trusting the illusion that nothing bad ever happens in a town this small, this quiet, this easy to forget. Walter knew better than most how fast that illusion could shatter. His phone rang at 11:40 that night. Unfamiliar number, but something in his gut told him to pick up anyway. "Briggs," he said. Silence. Then a voice, rough, older, carrying the particular gravel of decades of cigarettes and hard living. "It's been a long time, Walter." Walter's whole body went still. "Who is this?" "You know who this is. You just don't want to say the name out loud." A dry, humorless laugh. "Word travels fast in certain circles, old friend. Especially when a 67-year-old diner cook puts 3 grown men in the hospital, under 5 seconds. People remember hands like yours, even 20 years on." Walter's grip tightened on the phone. "This isn't a conversation I want to have. Didn't ask if you wanted it. I'm calling as a courtesy, Walter." One old soldier to another. "That kid running the crew that hit your place today, Ryan Cole. He's not the type to let something like this go quiet. He's already digging. And once he finds what he's digging for, he's not going to send 3 boys next time." Walter closed his eyes. "How many?" "However many it takes to bury the ghost he thinks he's found." A pause, heavy with old history, a man wanted to name outright. "You should have disappeared better, Walter. Picked a town nobody would ever look twice at." "I did," Walter said quietly. "For 20 years, I did. Well, somebody looked twice." The voice went quiet a beat. "You want my advice? Get that girl who works for you somewhere safe, and get that box down from wherever you've been hiding it. Because if Ryan Cole finds out what I think he's about to find out, he's not coming back for a protection payment. He's coming back to prove something." The line went dead before Walter could answer. He stood in his dark kitchen, a long time after, phone still pressed to his ear, even though there was nothing left to hear. His mind racing through calculations he hadn't made in over 2 decades, threat assessments, exit strategies, contingencies for a war he'd hoped never to fight again. Then he walked back to the table, sat, and finally opened the steel box. Inside, resting on a folded square of faded denim, lay a leather patch, worn and cracked with age, edges frayed from decades of handling. Walter lifted it slowly, turning it over in his scarred hands, and for just a moment, something crossed his face that Emily would never have recognized. Not the gentle patience of the diner owner, but something older, harder, thick with grief and memory both. He set the patch on the table and stared at it until the sun came up. **5***. Ryan Cole hadn't slept either. He sat in the garage, behind the bar, that same grainy photograph glowing on Danny's screen. -1 men gathered around him, every able member of the crew he could reach on short notice, most of them bleary-eyed, half annoyed at being summoned in the middle of the night over what they assumed was an overreaction to a bar fight. "You dragged us out of bed for this." One of them, a heavy-set man named Duke who'd ridden with Ryan since the beginning, muttered, "It's a diner cook, Ryan. We hit diner cooks all the time. Read it," Ryan said, gesturing at the screen. "All of you, read it before you say another word." The men crowded around Danny's monitor, and one by one their expressions shifted. Irritation, then confusion, then something closer to unease as they scrolled through what Danny had dug up. Old articles, court records, a photograph of a man decades younger, but unmistakably the same person, standing beside a motorcycle with an expression that made even the toughest men in the room fall quiet. "This is bull," Duke said finally, though the confidence had drained out of his voice. "This can't be the same guy. Some old war story blown up 10 times over by whatever reporter wrote it. You think I didn't consider that? Ryan snapped. Danny cross-checked everything. Court dates, service records, even an old DMV photo from 30 years back. It's him, Duke, same man who put Marcus and Tommy in the hospital yesterday. Marcus, still cradling his splintered wrist, stared at the screen with dawning horror. That can't be right. Guy in the photo's built like a truck. The guy who fought us yesterday was just some old man in an apron. People change how they look, Ryan said. They don't change what they know how to do. Silence settled over the garage. Even Duke, who prided himself on never flinching in front of the crew, found himself staring at that photograph with something close to doubt. So what do we do? Danny asked quietly, still seated. Want me to keep digging? Find out where he's been the last 20 years? What he's actually capable of now? No. Ryan stood slowly, jaw tight, eyes hard. We don't need to know what he was. We need him to understand what we are now. Ryan, Marcus started. He's an old man. Ryan cut him off, his voice rising with something that sounded like desperation wearing confidence's clothes. Whatever he used to be, however many stories are attached to his name, he's 67, and he runs a diner in a town nobody's ever heard of. He got lucky yesterday. Caught you all off guard. That's it. That's all that happened. Boss. Duke's voice had gone quieter, more careful. I've heard stories about outfits from that era. Guys who came up in that world back then. If even half of what's in these articles is real, I don't care what's true, Ryan said, his voice cracking with barely restrained anger. I built this crew from nothing. I'm not letting some geriatric short-order cook make me look weak in front of every business owner in this county. Word gets out that Walter Briggs beat the Black Vipers, and we just walked away. We're finished. Nobody pays protection money to a crew that got humiliated by a 67-year-old man with a spatula. The garage stayed silent a long moment. So what's the plan? Marcus finally asked. Ryan's eyes moved slowly around the room, settling on each man in turn, something cold and final creeping into his expression. We go back, he said. Tomorrow night. All of us this time. We make an example out of that diner, so loud, so public, that everyone in this county understands exactly what happens when someone thinks they can embarrass the Black Vipers and just walk away clean. And if the stories about him are true, Duke asked, if he really is what that article says he was, Ryan's jaw tightened, but he didn't answer directly. Instead he turned back to the screen, staring once more at that grainy old photo, at the hard, cold eyes of a much younger Walter Briggs standing beside his bike. Then I guess we're about to find out how much of that old world is still alive in him, Ryan said quietly, and how much of it died 20 years ago, along with whatever life he used to have. Nobody in the garage slept much after that. *6*6 Emily arrived at the diner early the next morning to find Walter already there, standing behind the counter, exactly as always, coffee already brewing, bacon already filling the small dining room with its smell. But something about him was different. She noticed it the second she stepped through the newly repaired door, a stillness in the way he carried himself, a weight behind his eyes that hadn't been there before yesterday's fight. You look like you didn't sleep, she said, tying on her apron as she moved behind the counter. Didn't much. She stopped what she was doing and looked at him straight on. What happened after I left last night? He was quiet a moment, wiping down a mug that was already clean, buying himself time. Got a phone call. From who? Someone from a long time ago. He set the mug down. Someone warning me that the men who came in here yesterday aren't going to let this go. Emily's stomach tightened. What does that mean? It means they're probably coming back. And when they do, they're not sending 3 men. Then we call Sheriff Reyes. We call the county. We call someone. Walter O'Reyes has 4 deputies and 400 square miles to cover, Walter said, his voice steady, almost gentle, despite the weight of what he was saying. By the time backup got here, if something happened, it'd already be over. So what are you saying? Her voice rose slightly, fear breaking through her usual composure. That we're on our own. That there's nothing we can do. Walter looked at her for a long moment, and something in his face softened, the way it always did when he was trying to shield her from something without telling her the whole truth. "I'm saying you should take a few days off," he said. "Go stay with your sister in Columbus. Take your daughter. Let things settle before you come back." "Absolutely not." Emily crossed her arms. The same stubbornness that had carried her through 2 years of single motherhood and a job most people would have quit within a month setting into her jaw. "I'm not running off and leaving you here to deal with whatever's coming." "Emily, no." She stepped closer, her eyes fierce despite the fear underneath. "You gave me a job when nobody else would. You've looked out for me and my daughter for 2 years without ever once making it feel like charity. I'm not walking out on you now just because things are about to get dangerous." Walter studied her a long moment, something complicated moving behind his eyes. Pride, maybe, or something closer to old grief. The weight of having cared about people before and watched danger find them anyway. "You don't understand what you're choosing to stay for," he said quietly. "Then explain it to me." He hesitated, and for a moment Emily thought he might finally open up about whatever weight he'd been quietly carrying the whole 2 years she'd known him. Whatever history had left him capable of moving the way he'd moved yesterday. Whatever name had been spoken on that late-night call that had clearly rattled him to his core. But before he could speak, the bell jingled and Sheriff Reyes walked in, face grim, a folded newspaper tucked under one arm. "Walter," Reyes said without preamble, "we need to talk, privately." Emily glanced between the two men, feeling the room shift. "I'll go start prepping the kitchen," she said quietly, though her eyes lingered on Walter a moment longer before she disappeared through the swinging door. Once she was gone, Reyes set the newspaper down and slid it across the counter. "This came across my desk this morning," he said. "Prescott County Sheriff sent it over as a courtesy. Given what happened here yesterday." Walter looked down. A report detailing an assault at a hardware store in Prescott. The same crew. The same pattern of violence and intimidation Reyes had described days earlier. "I already know about the Black Vipers, Tom. That's not what I'm here about." Reyes lowered his voice, leaning in. "I did some digging last night, Walter, after what happened yesterday. After hearing you took down 3 grown men without breaking a sweat, I got curious. Made a call to a buddy of mine who used to work federal task force stuff, gang intelligence, organized crime." Walter's expression didn't change, but his eyes went very still. "He didn't want to tell me much," Reyes went on. "Said certain names get certain files flagged, certain files get sealed. But he told me one thing, and Walter, I need you straight with me about it." He said the name Walter Briggs came back connected to something called the Iron Wolves. Old outlaw motorcycle club. Disbanded or gone quiet sometime in the early 2000s. Said there were rumors, just rumors. He was clear about that. That the Wolves had some kind of working relationship with the Hells Angels back in the day. Alliance, not membership, but close enough the two crossed paths on operations. Reyes paused. "And he said your name specifically came up attached to something they called the Millbrook Ghost. Except apparently Millbrook wasn't the name of this town back then. It was a code name for a person." The diner had gone very quiet. Walter stood behind the counter, hands flat on the surface, staring down at the newspaper without really seeing it. "Is any of that true?" Reyes' voice had gone low, careful, the voice of a man who'd known someone 15 years, and was only now realizing he might not have known them at all. Walter was quiet a long moment. When he finally spoke, his voice carried none of its usual warmth, just a flat, tired honesty that felt more revealing than any denial could have been. "I stopped being that person a long time ago, Tom. That's not an answer. It's the only one I've got. I need to know." Walter met the sheriff's eyes directly. "What I need you to understand is that whoever I was back then, whatever I did, I buried it. I chose this instead." He gestured around the diner, at the familiar tables, the faded booths, the smell of coffee that had defined his mornings for over 2 decades. "This town, this life, I chose it because I wanted something different than what I had before. And now the past is showing up at your front door." Yes, Ray exhaled slowly, rubbing a hand over his face. Walter, if even half of what my buddy hinted at is true, we're not talking about a local gang problem anymore. We're talking about something a whole lot bigger than 4 deputies and a sheriff's office can handle. I know. Then help me understand what we're actually facing. Right now, all I've got is a scared young waitress, a boarded up front door, and a diner owner who apparently used to be tangled up with one of the most dangerous motorcycle organizations in American history. None of that adds up to a plan that keeps this town safe. Walter looked at the sheriff a long moment, and something in his expression finally, slowly began to shift. Not quite a decision yet, but the start of one. Give me until tonight, he said quietly. I need to make a few calls. Walter, Tom. Walter's voice hardened, just enough to end the conversation. I need until tonight. Ray studied him, clearly unsatisfied, but recognizing, the way he had the night before, that Walter Briggs was not a man who could be pushed past the walls he'd built. He nodded once, gathered his newspaper, and left without another word. Though the worrying on his face lingered in the empty space behind him, Walter stood alone in the diner a long time after the cruiser pulled away, staring down at his own scarred hands, at the weight of a past he'd spent 20 years trying to bury, finally, inevitably clawing its way back into daylight. **7**. That evening, once the diner had closed, Walter drove 40 minutes outside Millbrook to a stretch of rural highway where an old, weathered garage sat half hidden behind a stand of oak trees. He hadn't been there in over a decade, but his hands remembered the drive without needing directions, muscle memory guiding him down the back roads as if no time had passed at all. The man waiting inside was older than Walter, grey-bearded, built thick through the shoulders despite his years, wearing a leather vest with faded patches that told a story most people would never be able to read. Walter Briggs. The man broke into a slow smile. Never thought I'd see you walk through that door again. Hello, Cutter. The old man laughed, shaking his head. Nobody's called me that in 15 years. Everybody calls me Earl now. Boring old man name for a boring old man life. He gestured towards a folding chairs by a workbench cluttered with motorcycle parts. Sit. You look like a man carrying the whole world on his back. Walter sat. For a long moment neither man spoke, the silence between them heavy with decades of shared history that didn't need explaining. Got a call last night, Walter said finally. Somebody warning me a crew calling themselves the Black Vipers is coming after me and everyone I care about. Earl's expression sobered instantly. Heard about that. Word travels fast when a legend wakes up, Walter. Even one that's been asleep 20 years. I'm not a legend, Earl. I'm a 67-year-old man who runs a diner. Tell that to the 3 boys you put in the hospital yesterday. Earl leaned forward, eyes suddenly serious. Walter, I know why you walked away. Understood it then. Understand it now. After everything that happened with Marie, after what it cost you. Don't, Walter said quietly, a warning in his voice that stopped Earl mid-sentence. Earl raised his hands, backing off. Fair enough. Old wounds. I get it. He was quiet a beat, studying his old friend's face. But you didn't drive 40 minutes out here to catch up, Walter. You're here because you need something. I need to know what's left, Walter said. Of the old network. The people who used to have my back when I still had a back worth having. Earl considered the question carefully. Most of the old guards gone, Walter. Dead. In prison. Or scattered like me. Living quiet lives under different names in different towns. Hoping nobody ever comes looking. But there's still a few of us left. A few who'd remember what you did for this territory before you vanished. Would they help? Depends what you're asking them to help with. Earl's eyes narrowed slightly. You planning on going to war with this Black Vipers crew, Walter? Because that's not you anymore. You walked away from that life for a reason. I didn't ask for this fight. Earl, it came to my front door and grabbed a young woman who's never done anything but trust me. I don't get to walk away from that. Earl studied him a long moment, and something like understanding, maybe even respect, crossed his weathered features. "All right," he said finally. "I'll make some calls. See who's still willing to remember old debts. But Walter," his voice grew serious, "you need to understand something. If you open this door again, if you let the old world back in even a little, there's no guarantee you get to shut it afterward. Some things, once you wake them up, they don't go back to sleep just because you want them to." Walter nodded slowly, eyes distant, heavy with the weight of a decision he'd clearly been wrestling with since the phone rang the night before. "I understand," he said quietly, "but I'd rather wake up every ghost from my past than let anything happen to that girl, or this town, because I was too afraid to face what I used to be." Earl reached out and clasped Walter's shoulder, a gesture heavy with old brotherhood, old loyalty, old history neither man needed to say aloud. "Then let's make some calls," Earl said. "And Walter, for what it's worth, welcome back. **8**. By the time Walter got back to Millbrook late that night, something in him had changed. Emily noticed it the following morning, a different quality to his stillness, less like a man hiding from his past, more like a man who'd finally, quietly made peace with the fact that his past was about to become his present again. "You went somewhere last night," she said, watching him closely as he moved through his morning routine. "I did. Going to tell me where?" "Not yet." He glanced at her, something in his expression softening. "But I need to ask you something important, Emily. I need you to really think before you answer. If things get dangerous here, genuinely dangerous, not just broken dishes and slammed doors, I need to know you'll take your daughter and stay with your sister until this is over. Not because I don't trust you, not because I don't want you here, because I need to know you're safe while I handle what's coming." Emily's jaw tightened, the same stubbornness from the day before flaring back up. "Walter, please, please," he said, quieter than she'd ever heard him say anything, carrying a vulnerability that cut through her resistance more effectively than any argument could have. "I've lost people before, Emily, people I cared about, because I let them get too close to a war that wasn't theirs to fight. I can't do that again. I won't survive doing that again." Something in his voice, some old, buried grief finally breaking the surface, dissolved Emily's anger into something closer to understanding. "Who did you lose?" she asked softly. Walter was quiet a long moment, eyes distant, lost somewhere she couldn't follow. "Her name was Marie," he said finally, so quiet she nearly missed it. "She was my wife, and she died because of choices I made a long time ago. Choices that brought danger to our front door, the same way it's coming to this diner's front door right now." Emily's breath caught. In 2 years working for Walter Briggs, she had never once heard him mention a wife, never seen a photograph, never sensed even the faintest hint that he'd loved and lost someone the way his words now suggested. "Walter, I'm so sorry. That was a long time ago." He straightened slightly, pulling himself back from the edge of memory. "But it taught me something I've never forgotten. When danger comes for men like the ones I used to run with, it doesn't just come for the man himself. It comes for everyone standing close enough to matter to him." He looked at her directly, eyes heavy with old sorrow and new resolve. "I won't let that happen to you or your daughter." Emily wiped at her eyes, nodding slowly, the fight draining from her posture, even as the worrying deepened. "Okay," she whispered. "If it gets bad, I'll go. I promise. Thank you." They stood together in comfortable, heavy silence, the weight of everything unsaid settling between them like a held breath. Then, from outside, the low rumble of motorcycle engines began to build in the distance. Emily's head snapped toward the window, her whole body going rigid. "Walter, I hear them." His voice went flat, focused, every trace of vulnerability vanishing beneath cold, calculating stillness. He moved to the window, watching as the sound grew closer, multiplying, not 3 engines this time, but many more, a swarm converging on the diner from multiple directions. "Oh my God," Emily whispered, counting the shapes now visible on the horizon. "Walter, there's so many." Walter's jaw tightened as he counted alongside her, his mind automatically cataloguing numbers, positions, angles of approach, all the old instincts flooding back with terrifying clarity. 11, he said quietly. Maybe 12. What do we do? Walter turned to her, and for just a moment the old warmth returned to his eyes, steady despite the storm bearing down on them. You go to the kitchen, he said. You lock the back door behind you. You call Sherry Phrase. And you do not come back out here, no matter what you hear. Do you understand me? Walter, I'm not going to just hide while, Emily, his voice carried an authority she'd never heard from him before. Absolute, unshakable. This isn't a discussion. Go. She hesitated only a moment before nodding and hurrying toward the kitchen. Hands trembling, she reached for the phone. Walter stood alone in the dining room, watching through the window as 11 motorcycles fanned across the parking lot, engines roaring so the ground itself seemed to vibrate. Ryan Cole dismounted first, face set into a hard, determined mask, and behind him 10 more men climbed off, some carrying chains, others bats, and near the back of the group, Walter's eyes caught the unmistakable glint of a handgun. Tucked into a waistband, Walter's hand moved slowly toward the small, steel box he'd carried in from his truck that morning and slid beneath the counter, unopened, but ready, waiting for exactly this moment. He didn't open it yet. Instead, he walked calmly to the boarded-up front door, unlocked it, and stepped outside to face 11 armed men alone, his expression as unbothered as if he was simply checking the weather. Walter Briggs, Ryan Cole called across the lot, his voice tight with barely controlled tension, despite his obvious effort to sound confident. You know why we're here? I've got a pretty good guess, Walter said evenly. You embarrassed my crew yesterday. Put 3 of my men in the hospital. That's not something I let go. No matter who you used to be. You don't have to do this, son. Walter's voice was quiet, almost gentle, the voice of a man offering one final chance before something irreversible happened. Turn around. Take your men. Leave this town. Find somewhere else to run your operation. I promise you, this is the last warning you get. Ryan's jaw tightened, and for just a moment, something like doubt flickered across his face. The same doubt Walter had seen in Marcus's eyes the day before. The recognition of facing something far more dangerous than expected. But then his expression hardened again, pride and fear curdling into recklessness. We're not leaving, Ryan said, raising his voice for his men to hear. Whatever you used to be, old man, that was 20 years ago. You're outnumbered 11 to 1. Whatever's left in those old bones isn't gonna be enough. Walter looked slowly around at the 11 men surrounding him, chains and bats catching the afternoon light, and something in his stillness shifted. Not fear, but a quiet, terrible readiness. You're wrong about one thing, he said quietly. Yeah. What's that? Walter's eyes moved past Ryan, toward the tree line at the edge of the lot, where the faint, distant rumble of more engines had just begun to build. You said I was outnumbered, Walter said, the faintest, coldest smile touching the corner of his mouth. I don't think that's true anymore. Ryan's confidence faltered for the first time, his head snapping toward the growing sound behind him, and in the fading light, the first shapes of a dozen more motorcycles emerged from the tree line, old riders, grey-bearded and weathered, wearing leather vests marked with patches that made several of the younger black vipers go visibly pale. That's not possible, one of Ryan's men whispered, staring at the approaching riders with dawning horror. Those are Iron Wolf's colors. I thought that club died out years ago. Ryan turned back to Walter, and for the first time since arriving in that parking lot, real fear finally cracked through his carefully built confidence. You called them, he said, voice unsteady. You actually called them. Walter stood perfectly still, watching his old brothers arrive to stand at his back for the first time in 20 years. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a weight that made every man in that lot understand, with sudden and absolute clarity, exactly how badly they'd underestimated the quiet old diner owner in front of them. I told you, Walter said quietly. This was the last warning we're going to get. Asterisk asterisk 9 asterisk asterisk. The dozen riders fanned out across the lot in loose, practiced formation, engines dying one by one, until the only sound left was wind moving through the trees and the ragged breathing of 11 young men who'd walked, Into this expecting an easy win over a lone old man, Earl swung off his bike first, moving with the unhurried confidence of a man who'd done this exact thing 100 times in a different lifetime. He walked toward Walter without so much as a glance at Ryan Cole, as though the Black Viper's leader weren't worth his notice. "Told you we'd remember old debts," Earl said quietly, coming to stand at Walter's shoulder. "Wasn't sure you'd actually come. Wasn't sure I would either." Earl's eyes swept across the lot, cataloguing the young men the same way Walter had from the window minutes earlier. "But then I got to thinking about Marie, and about what kind of man just watches from the sidelines, while the same kind of trouble comes for the only family he's got left." Walter's jaw tightened at his wife's name, but he said nothing, his focus locked on Ryan Cole, who stood frozen near the center of the lot, his bravado visibly crumbling. "This isn't what you think," Ryan said, raising his voice, though it carried none of the confidence it had minutes earlier. "You think a dozen old men on motorcycles scares us. We've got numbers. We've got youth. You've got a decision to make." Walter interrupted, quiet, but carrying easily across the lot, and about 10 seconds to make it before this stops being a conversation. Ryan's eyes darted between his own men, several of whom had already begun shifting nervously, glancing toward their bikes, calculating exit routes the way frightened young men do when the math of a situation suddenly stops favoring them. Marcus, still favoring his splintered wrist, had gone pale as a sheet, staring at the iron wolves patches with something close to recognition. "Boss," Marcus muttered, "those aren't just old bikers. Those are—" "I know what they are," Ryan snapped, voice cracking slightly on the words. One of the older riders, heavy-set, a scar running the length of his jaw, stepped forward beside Earl, his eyes fixed on Ryan with pure, undisguised contempt. "You boys picked the wrong diner to shake down," he said. "Word of advice, since you clearly didn't do your homework before you went looking for trouble. This whole county used to run through men like us. Every business, every back road, every deal that mattered for 200 miles in any direction. We didn't disappear because we got weak. We disappeared because we got old, and most of us decided we'd rather die quiet than die loud. But loud's still available," Earl added. "If that's what you're asking for." The silence that followed stretched long and taut, broken only by the nervous shuffling of the younger Black Vipers, several of whom had already begun inching backward toward their bikes without waiting on Ryan's order. Ryan stood at the center of it all, fists clenched, jaw tight, caught in the impossible position of a man who'd built his entire identity on never backing down, now facing the very real possibility that backing down was the only option that didn't end in bloodshed. "This isn't over," he said finally, voice low and shaking with barely contained fury. "You think this changes anything? You think I'm scared of a bunch of geriatrics playing dress up in old leather?" "No," Walter said calmly. "I think you're a young man about to make a choice that either saves your crew or ends it. I'd think carefully before deciding which one you want." Ryan's eyes locked with Walter's, and for one long, charged moment, it seemed the entire lot might erupt into chaos regardless of numbers, regardless of the math, simply because pride sometimes overrides every rational instinct a man has. Then, from somewhere behind Ryan, one of his own men spoke up, voice trembling. Boss, I got a kid at home. I didn't sign up to go up against actual iron wolves for a protection racket in some nowhere town." The words seemed to break something in the group's collective resolve. Another man shifted his weight, then another. Fear rippled through the Black Vipers like a current, and Ryan, watching his own crew's confidence evaporate in real time, understood with sudden, humiliating clarity that he'd already lost this confrontation before it truly began. "Fine," he spat, voice thick with barely controlled rage. "Fine. We're leaving." He pointed a shaking finger at Walter, composure fracturing with every word. "But this isn't finished, old man. You think this is the end? You think a dozen washed-up bikers scares me off for good? I'm going to find out everything there is to know about you, your past, everyone you've ever cared about. And when I come back, I'm not bringing 11 men. I'm bringing everyone I know, prepared for exactly what you are. Then I suppose we'll be ready," Walter said quietly. Ryan held his gaze a moment longer, then turned sharply, storming back toward his bike, his men falling into ragged formation behind him, several casting nervous glances back at the Iron Wolves as they mounted up. The engines roared back to life, one by one, and within minutes the Black Vipers had pulled out of the lot and vanished down Route 9, leaving nothing behind but settling dust and the fading echo of wounded pride. Walter exhaled slowly, tension finally draining from his shoulders. Beside him, Earl let out a low chuckle. "Well," he said, "that went about as well as I figured. You figured it would go badly. I figured he'd talk tough, and then run the second the math stopped working in his favor. Kids like that, all fire, no discipline. They fold the moment's real danger of them in the eye." Earl clapped a hand on Walter's shoulder. "But you heard what he said. This isn't over. Boy's got wounded pride now, and wounded pride's more dangerous than simple greed ever was." Walter nodded slowly, watching the empty road where the Black Vipers had disappeared, his mind already working through the implications. He's going to dig deeper, find out more than just an old newspaper clipping, probably. And when he finds out the rest of it, he's going to come back with everything he's got. Which means, Earl finished quietly, we need to figure out what everything he's got actually looks like before he shows up with it. The diner's front door creaked open behind them, and Emily emerged slowly, face pale, eyes wide with relief and lingering terror as she took in the scene. The dozen riders, the empty lot, Walter standing calm and unharmed at the center of it all. "They're gone?" she asked, voice unsteady. "For now," Walter said. She crossed the distance quickly, and for a moment it looked as though she might embrace him before catching herself, settling instead for gripping his forearm tightly, knuckles white. "I called Sheriff Reyes. He's on his way. I told him everything, the motorcycles, the numbers, all of it. Good. He needs to know." Emily's eyes moved past Walter to Earl and the other riders, taking in their weathered faces, their old leather vests, the quiet authority radiating off every one of them despite their age. "Who are these men?" Walter was quiet a moment, glancing at Earl, some unspoken understanding passing between them. "Old friends," Walter said finally, "from a life I thought I'd left behind for good, **10**, Sheriff." Reyes arrived 12 minutes later to find the diner's lot filled with motorcycles that hadn't been there on his last visit. A dozen grey-bearded riders standing in loose conversation at the boarded-up door, and Walter Briggs at the center of it all, looking more like the commander of some quiet, aging army than a diner owner who served coffee and eggs 6 days a week. "Walter," Reyes climbed out of his cruiser slowly, eyes sweeping the scene with obvious disbelief. "You want to explain what exactly I'm looking at?" "Reinforcements," Walter said simply. "Reinforcements." Reyes ran a hand over his face, clearly struggling to process the scale of what had unfolded in his small, quiet county over the last 48 hours. "Walter, 3 days ago, a diner owner who hadn't so much as gotten a speeding ticket in 15 years. Now I've got reports of an 11-man gang converging on your restaurant. A dozen more men showing up on bikes matching patches. Danny at the station tells me belong to an organization the federal government spent the better part of 2 decades trying to dismantle. And a mysterious phone call warning you about danger before or any of this even happened. I know how it looks, Tom. Do you? Because from where I'm standing, this entire county's about to become a battlefield between 2 motorcycle organizations, and I've got 4 deputies and a Tuesday budget meeting to worrying about." Earl stepped forward then, extending a weathered hand toward the sheriff with an easy, disarming smile. "Sheriff, name's Earl. I understand your concern, and for what it's worth, none of us came looking for trouble. We came because an old friend needed backup, and because none of us particularly like watching young punks terrorize small towns that can't defend themselves." Reyes eyed the offered hand a moment before shaking it, expression still wary. "And if I told you I need everyone connected to whatever's about to happen here to stand down and let law enforcement handle it, I tell you, law enforcement's already tried handling the Black Vipers for the better part of a year, and near as I can tell, they've hit 4 towns and put God knows how many people in the hospital without a single arrest sticking. Earl's tone stayed polite, but there was steel underneath. No disrespect intended, Sheriff. Sometimes a problem needs a different kind of solution than the one you've got in your toolbox. Ray's jaw tightened, but he didn't argue, mostly because he couldn't. He turned back to Walter instead, lowering his voice. Walter, I need you straight with me. Is this going to escalate? Because if it does, if this turns into an actual war on the streets of my county, people are going to get hurt, maybe killed. I need to know what I'm actually dealing with. Walter met the sheriff's eyes steadily. I don't want a war, Tom. Never wanted any of this. All I wanted was a quiet life and a diner that served good coffee. But Ryan Cole made a choice yesterday, and he's going to make another one soon, and I can't control which direction he decides to go. Then help me get ahead of it. Give me something, anything. Ray's voice carried real desperation now, the weight of an entire county pressing down on him. You clearly know things about organizations like this that I don't. Where they get their resources, how they operate, what their next move is likely to be. Help me build a case that actually sticks instead of watching this spiral into something none of us can control. Walter was quiet a long moment, considering, and something in his expression shifted. The beginning of a decision that would carry consequences far beyond what anyone standing in that lot could yet fully understand. All right, he said finally. But if I help you build a case, Tom, it means opening up parts of my past I've spent 20 years trying to keep buried. And once that door opens, I don't know that I can close it again. I understand. I don't think you do, Walter said quietly. But I appreciate you saying it anyway. **11*** that night, after Ray's had left, and the iron walls had scattered to various motels and campsites around the county, Earl insisting they'd stay close until the situation resolved one way or another. Walter sat alone in the diner's back office, the same steel box from his kitchen table now open in front of him, its contents spread across the desk in dim lamplight. Old photographs, a worn leather-bound journal, a stack of documents bound with a rubber band gone brittle with age, and at the very bottom of the box, a folded newspaper clipping so old and yellowed it nearly crumbled when Walter unfolded it, revealing a headline from over 2 decades earlier, about a federal investigation into organized crime networks spanning 3 states, an investigation that had ended, according to the brief follow-up article beneath it, with the disappearance of its primary confidential informant. Walter stared at the clipping a long time, his weathered face unreadable in the lamplight. A knock at the office door pulled him from his thoughts. Emily stood in the doorway, having stayed late despite his earlier insistence that she go home and rest. You should be home, Walter said, not looking up. I know. She stepped inside anyway, eyes drifting to the scattered contents of the box. I couldn't leave, not after everything that happened today. She hesitated, then asked the question that had clearly been building since the parking lot confrontation. Walter, what were you before all this? Before the diner? Walter was quiet a long moment, fingers resting lightly on the edge of the old clipping. I was a lot of things, Emily. Most of them I'm not proud of. He looked up at her, finally, eyes heavy with old weight. But the short version, the version that matters right now, is that I used to work with a federal task force, undercover, embedded inside organizations like the ones the Black Vipers are trying to become. Organized crime networks, outlaw motorcycle clubs, the kind of operations that move drugs and money and worse across state lines. Emily's breath caught. You were a cop. Not exactly. I wasn't law enforcement myself. I was something else, a man they recruited because I already had connections inside that world. Connections I'd built long before anyone in the government came asking for help. He gestured at the clipping. For almost 8 years, I lived inside that world, fought alongside men who thought I was one of them, earned trust I didn't deserve, so I could hand federal prosecutors the evidence they needed to take down networks that had been operating untouched for decades. That's why those men called you a ghost, Emily said slowly, piecing it together. Why your name's connected to the Iron Wolves, to something bigger, something dangerous. The Iron Wolves were real, Walter said. Earl and the others out there tonight. They were real brothers, real friends, most of whom never knew what I actually was until the day everything came apart. But underneath the Iron Wolves, connected to networks stretching from here to the Gulf Coast, there were far more dangerous organizations. Operations that moved guns, drugs, people. Organizations the federal government spent years trying to infiltrate before they finally succeeded. Through me. What happened? When it all came apart, Walter's jaw tightened, and for a moment Emily thought he might close the door on the conversation the way he always had before. Instead, he reached for one of the photographs on the desk and slid it toward her. A picture of a smiling woman with dark hair and warm eyes, standing beside a much younger Walter, both of them caught mid-laugh in some forgotten moment of happiness. That's Marie, he said quietly. My wife. She didn't know what I really did, not the full truth of it, not until the case broke, and the organization I'd infiltrated figured out who had betrayed them. His voice grew rougher, heavier with old grief. They came for her because they couldn't get to me in time. I was already in protective custody by then, already being relocated, already becoming someone new. But she wasn't fast enough, wasn't protected fast enough. Emily's hand rose to her mouth, understanding dawning with horrible clarity. Walter, I'm so sorry. I've had 20 years to live with it, Walter said, his voice steadying with the practiced control of old, well-worn grief. 20 years to understand that the price of what I did, the price of tearing down those organizations, was paid by the one person who never signed up to pay it. I built this life, this diner, this quiet town, because I needed somewhere the ghost couldn't find me, somewhere I could exist without dragging anyone else into danger ever again. And now they found you anyway. Not the same people, Walter said. The Black Vipers are young, disorganized, nothing like the networks I used to fight. But Ryan Cole is digging into a past, connected to something much bigger than he understands. And if he pulls on that thread hard enough, he's not going to find just an old biker legend. He's going to find federal case files, protected witness records, and possibly people who still have very good reasons to want me dead. Emily sank slowly into the chair across from the desk, processing the full weight of what he'd told her. So this isn't just about a protection racket anymore. No, Walter said quietly. This is about whether the past I spent 20 years burying is about to get you, this town, and everyone I care about, killed alongside me. Asterisk asterisk 12 asterisk asterisk 3/10. Watchful days passed. The Black Vipers didn't return to the diner, but reports trickled in from around the county. Increased activity at their compound outside Prescott. New faces arriving. Unfamiliar trucks making late-night deliveries that Ray's deputies noted, but couldn't yet legally investigate. Walter spent those 3 days working alongside Ray's and, cautiously, a federal contact Earl had managed to reach through channels unused for over a decade, a retired agent named Patricia Voss, who'd once run the task force Walter worked for, now living in quiet retirement to states away, but still carrying enough institutional memory and lingering connections to be useful. She says Ryan Cole isn't operating alone, Walter told Ray's on the third evening. The two of them huddled over the diner's back table with case files spread between them. Voss thinks the Black Vipers are being used, maybe without Ryan even fully realizing it, fed drugs and resources by a larger network operating out of Cleveland, the kind that specifically targets small, under-policed counties like this one, because there's less law enforcement attention and easier targets. So Ryan Cole isn't the real threat, Ray's said slowly. He's just the visible piece. Voss thinks so. Which means even if we neutralize the Black Vipers completely, whoever's actually running things behind them just finds another crew, another town, another set of desperate young men willing to do their dirty work. Walter rubbed his eyes, exhaustion evident in every line of his weathered face. This isn't just about protecting my diner anymore, Tom. If Voss is right, we're looking at a chance to take down something a lot bigger than a local gang problem. Ray's exhaled slowly, staring down at the scattered files. And you're willing to do that? Reopen everything you spent 20 years trying to close? I don't see another option that doesn't end with more towns like Millbrook getting terrorized, more business owners hurt, more young men like Ryan Cole chewed up by something bigger than they understand. Walter's voice hardened with quiet resolve. I buried myself once to keep people from becoming collateral damage in my war. I'm not going to bury myself again while more people become collateral damage in someone else's. Before Reyes could respond, the diner's phone rang, sharp and sudden in the quiet office. Emily answered from the front counter, and moments later her voice carried back to them, tight with alarm. Walter, it's for you. It's Earl. Walter crossed to the phone quickly, Reyes closed behind, both men's expressions sharpening with concern. Earl, what is it? Walter. Earl's voice was tense, clipped, barely containing its urgency. One of the boys did some digging tonight, poking around the Viper compound from a distance, just trying to get a read on their numbers. He came back with something you need to hear right now. What did he find? Ryan Cole's not just planning another run at your diner, Earl said grimly. He's been in contact with someone big. And whoever it is, they're sending reinforcements. Real reinforcements. Not local kids in leather jackets. We're talking serious manpower, serious weapons. Arriving sometime in the next 48 hours, Walter's grip tightened on the phone, his mind racing through implications, contingencies. The sudden and terrifying realization that whatever quiet, contained conflict had begun in his diner's parking lot was rapidly becoming something far larger and far more dangerous than any of them had anticipated. Do we know who's sending them? Earl was quiet a moment, and when he spoke again, his voice carried a weight that made Walter's stomach drop before the words even registered. Walter, Earl said slowly, the name that came back, the organization Ryan Cole's apparently been talking to. It's connected to the same network you helped take down 20 years ago. Different leadership now, rebuilt over the years, but the same roots. The same people who've spent 2 decades wondering whatever happened to the confidential informant who put half their old operation behind bars. The back office went completely silent. Reyes and Emily stared at Walter as the full weight of Earl's words settled over the room, his equal presence. They know, Walter said quietly, voice barely above a whisper. They finally know where I am. Looks that way, Earl said grimly. Which means this isn't just about protecting your diner from some gang of young punks anymore, old friend. This is about protecting yourself and everyone around you from an organization that's been waiting 20 years for exactly this chance. Walter closed his eyes, phone still pressed to his ear. In that moment, standing in the back office of the small diner he'd built his entire quiet second life around, he understood with absolute, uncheckable clarity that the war he thought he'd escaped 2 decades earlier had finally, inevitably found its way back to him, and this time there would be no disappearing into a new identity, no starting over in some other forgotten town. This time, whatever came next would have to be faced head-on, in the town he'd come to love, surrounded by the people he'd come to care about more than he'd ever expected to care about anyone again. Tom, Walter said, turning to the sheriff, his voice steady despite the storm building behind his eyes. I think it's time we called in some real help, because what's coming isn't something a county sheriff's department or a handful of aging bikers can handle alone. Reyes nodded slowly, already reaching for his own phone. I know some people at the state level, maybe some federal contacts too. If what you're describing is as serious as it sounds, it's serious. Walter turned to Emily, his expression softening slightly despite the tension gripping the room. I need you to reconsider going to stay with your sister. Not because I don't trust you to handle yourself, but because what's coming in the next 48 hours is beyond anything either of us planned for. Emily's face had gone pale, but her jaw set with the same stubborn resolve Walter had come to recognize and quietly admire over the past 2 years. I already told you, she said, voice trembling but firm. I'm not running. Whatever's coming, we face it together. Walter looked at her a long moment, torn between old grief and new determination. between the instinct to protect and the recognition that Emily, like Marie before her, had already made her own choice about the risk she was willing to accept. "Then we'd better get ready," he said finally, his voice hardening with quiet resolve. "Because in 48 hours, everything I spent 20 years trying to bury is going to arrive on this town's doorstep. And this time, there won't be a warning phone call to get us ready for it." Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the diner's boarded front door, and somewhere in the darkness beyond Millbrook's quiet streets, the first pieces of a war 20 years in the making had already begun moving into position. **13**, the 48-hour countdown began the moment Walter hung up that phone, and by the following morning, Millbrook had transformed into something Sheriff Reyes had never once seen in 15 years, wearing a badge in this county. State police cruisers lined the road into town. A pair of unmarked federal vehicles sat parked discreetly behind the hardware store, their occupants keeping a low profile while coordinating with local law enforcement. And around Briggs Place, a loose perimeter had formed, a dozen motorcycles belonging to men who'd once called themselves Iron Wolves, their riders moving with the quiet, practiced discipline of soldiers preparing for a fight they'd hoped never to see again. "Patricia Vorse is driving him personally," Earl told Walter that morning, the two of them standing near the diner's repaired door, watching the town's transformation unfold around them. Said this was too important to coordinate over the phone. "She's bringing files, Walter, old case files tied to the network that's apparently sending people after you." "How long until she gets here?" "Couple hours." Earl studied his old friend's face carefully. "You doing all right? You've got that look." "What look?" "The one you used to get right before walking into a room full of men who wanted you dead, and somehow convincing every single one of them you belong there." Earl's voice softened. "You don't have to pretend with me, Walter, not after everything." Walter exhaled slowly, some of the careful control slipping from his expression. "I thought I buried this life deep enough that it would never find me again. Thought Marie's death would be the last price I ever paid for who I used to be." He looked out at the gathering forces around the diner. Federal agents, state police, aging bikers, all of them converging on this one small town because of choices he'd made decades earlier. "Now I'm watching an entire county mobilize because that grave wasn't deep enough. You didn't ask for any of this to happen again. Doesn't matter what I asked for. It's happening." Walter's jaw tightened. "And if Emily gets hurt because of it, if this town gets torn apart because I couldn't stay buried, then you'll do what you've always done," Earl interrupted firmly. "You'll fight until there's nothing left standing that can hurt the people you care about. That's who you are, Walter. Underneath the apron and the coffee pot. That's always been who you are." Before Walter could respond, Emily emerged from inside, face pale but set with determination. A stack of folders under her arm she'd apparently been organizing at his request. "Sheriff Reyes wants everyone in the back room," she said. "Says the federal agents here early." Patricia Vorse turned out to be a sharp-eyed woman in her 60s, silver hair cropped short and practical, her presence commanding despite her unassuming stature. She set a thick folder on the diner's back table and looked around at the assembled group. Walter, Reyes, Earl, and several other Iron Wolves riders who'd crowded into the small office. "I'm going to lay this out plainly," she said without preamble, "because we don't have time for anything else. 22 years ago, Walter Briggs was the single most valuable confidential informant this country's organized crime task force had ever recruited. The network he helped us dismantle stretched across 3 states, moved narcotics and weapons worth tens of millions annually, and was responsible for at least 11 confirmed murders during the years we tracked it." She opened the folder, spreading photographs and documents across the table. "When Walter's cover was blown, we lost the network's top leadership to federal prison. But organizations like that don't simply disappear once you cut off the head. They rebuild. Slower, quieter, more careful the second time around." She tapped a photograph of a heavy-set man in an expensive suit. "This is Victor Kessler, nephew of the man Walter's testimony sent away for life." Victor spent the last 15 years quietly rebuilding what his uncle lost. Unlike his uncle, he's been smart enough to stay off federal radar by keeping operations smaller, more distributed, harder to trace back to a single point of failure. And the Black Vipers, Reyes asked, one of at least 6 regional crews we now believe operate under Kessler's umbrella. Though most of them don't even realize it. Kessler doesn't run these operations directly. He provides resources, connections, sometimes protection from rival organizations, in exchange for a cut of whatever the local crews bring in. It's a smart model, deniable, distributed, exactly the kind of structure that's nearly impossible to prosecute, because no single crew leader can testify to Kessler's direct involvement. Voss's eyes moved to Walter. Ryan Cole made contact with someone inside Kessler's organization 3 days ago, right after his crew's confrontation with you at this diner. We've been monitoring certain communication channels since your name resurfaced in local law enforcement inquiries. When Kessler's people heard the name Briggs connected to an outlaw motorcycle legend who'd taken down 3 Black Vipers members without effort, they made the connection almost immediately. Walter's expression went hard, unreadable. So Kessler knows I'm alive, knows where I am. He does now. Voss's voice softened slightly, the first hint of genuine sympathy breaking through her clinical delivery. I'm sorry, Walter. We tried to keep your identity buried as deep as possible after the relocation. But 20 years is a long time to maintain absolute secrecy, especially once someone starts actively digging with the kind of resources Kessler has access to. What's he sending? Earl asked. Voss hesitated, glancing at the group before answering. Our intelligence suggests Kessler is dispatching a specialized team, not local muscle like the Black Vipers, professional enforcers, the kind of men Kessler keeps on retainer specifically for situations requiring permanent solutions. The room went very quiet. He's sending people to kill me, Walter said flatly. Yes, Voss said. And based on patterns we've observed with similar operations, anyone standing close enough to you when they arrive. Emily's face had gone white, her hands trembling as she gripped the folder she'd been holding. Walter noticed, and something in his expression tightened with old, familiar grief. How long until they get here? Our best estimate, based on communication patterns and typical deployment timelines for Kessler's people, is sometime tomorrow night. Voss closed the folder, which gives us roughly 30 hours to prepare a response. What kind of response? Reyes asked. Because I'll be honest, Agent Voss, my department is not equipped to handle professional hitmen dispatched by an organized crime syndicate. No offense taken, Sheriff. You're right. Voss's eyes swept the room again. This requires a coordinated effort, federal resources, state police support, and frankly, whatever tactical knowledge Walter and his old associates still carry about how organizations like Kessler's actually operate. All eyes turned to Walter, who stood silently a long moment, mind working through possibilities, contingencies, the terrible mathematics of a confrontation that could end in far more bloodshed than the parking lot standoff with Ryan Cole's crew days earlier. If Kessler's sending professionals, Walter said slowly, they're not going to announce themselves the way the Black Vipers did. They'll come quiet, efficient, probably split into teams. One to handle me directly, others to secure the perimeter and eliminate complications. His eyes moved to Emily, which means the first thing we need to do is get you, and anyone else unnecessary, to this fight as far from Millbrook as possible. Walter, I already told you. Emily, his voice cracked slightly, the careful control finally beginning to fracture under the weight of it all. This isn't the Black Vipers anymore. This isn't young men with chains and bats trying to scare a business owner into paying protection money. These are people who kill for a living, trained specifically to eliminate targets without hesitation or mercy. His eyes met hers. I can survive facing men like that. I don't know if I can survive watching you get hurt because you insisted on standing beside me. The room had gone completely silent. Every person present understood the weight of what Walter was saying, the raw vulnerability beneath his usual steady composure. Emily's eyes filled with tears, but her jaw remained set with the same stubborn resolve that had defined her from the start. "I understand what you're asking," she said quietly. "But Walter, if I leave now, if I run while you stay here facing something this dangerous, I don't think I could live with myself. You've protected me and my daughter for 2 years without ever once asking for anything back. Let me help protect you now. Emily, I'm not asking you to fight. I know I'm not trained for that," she interrupted gently, "but there has to be something I can do. Coordinate communications, help Sheriff Reyes manage logistics, something, please. Walter, don't ask me to just disappear while everyone else fights for this town." Walter stared at her a long moment, old grief and new affection warring visibly behind his eyes. Finally, reluctantly, he nodded. "All right," he said quietly. "But the moment things turn dangerous, the actual moment, you go to the safe location we establish. No arguments, no hesitation. I promise." Voss cleared her throat gently. "While I appreciate the emotional weight of this conversation, we have 30 hours to prepare a coordinated defense against a professional hit team, and I'd like to actually use that time, the next several hours dissolved into intense, focused planning. Voss coordinating federal resources to establish surveillance around the town's perimeter, Reyes mobilizing every available deputy alongside state police reinforcements, Earl and the Iron Wolves drawing on decades-old knowledge of tactical positioning and defensive strategy, and Walter moving through it all with a quiet, controlled intensity that reminded everyone present exactly why he'd once been valuable enough to a federal task force, that they'd risked everything to protect his identity. By late afternoon, a plan had taken shape. Federal agents positioned discreetly through town, undercover identities, state police maintaining a visible but non-threatening presence on the main roads leading into Millbrook, and the Iron Wolves stationed at key points around the diner itself, ready to provide immediate support if Kessler's team made their move there. "There's one more thing," Voss said as the planning session finally wound down. "We need bait." Walter's expression didn't change, though everyone else in the room went visibly tense. "You mean me? Kessler's team is coming for you specifically. Walter, if we try to hide you, relocate you somewhere else, they'll simply search until they find you, and we lose the advantage of controlling when and where this confrontation happens. But if you remain visible, predictable, exactly where they expect to find you, then we can control the engagement, force them into a position where you've got surveillance backup and the tactical advantage." Walter finished, essentially. "Yes." Voss studied him carefully. "I won't pretend this isn't asking a great deal of you, Walter. You'd be placing yourself directly in the path of trained killers. Trusting our coordination and preparation are enough to neutralize the threat before it reaches you." Walter was quiet a long moment, and when he finally spoke, his voice carried the same steady resolve that had defined every decision he'd made since Ryan Cole's crew first walked through his diner's front door. "I spent 20 years running from exactly this kind of confrontation," he said quietly. 20 years building a quiet life specifically, so I'd never have to face this world again. But I'm done running. If Kessler wants to send people after me, let them come. Let's finish what started 20 years ago, once and for all. **14**. That evening, as the sun sank toward the horizon and the various law enforcement and tactical teams settled into overnight positions around Millbrook, Walter found himself alone in the diner's kitchen, methodically prepping for close, despite the extraordinary circumstances around him. Old habits, it seemed, offered their own kind of comfort. Even in the face of danger. Emily found him there, wiping down the same counter she'd watched him wipe 100 times before. The familiar rhythm somehow more poignant now, given everything hanging over them. "You don't have to keep pretending everything's normal," she said softly, leaning in the doorway. Walter paused, setting down his rag. "Maybe I need to pretend a little while longer before everything changes again. Can I ask you something?" "You can ask. Do you regret it?" Her voice was gentle, careful. "Everything you did back then, the undercover work, the testimony, all of it. If you could go back and choose differently, choose not to become an informant, would you? Walter considered the question seriously, eyes distant with old memory. I've asked myself that more times than I can count, especially in the years right after Marie died. There were nights I convinced myself that if I had just stayed quiet, stayed loyal to the world I was born into, she'd still be alive. He shook his head slowly. But then I think about the 11 murders that network was directly responsible for, the families it destroyed, the drugs it moved, the young lives it ruined, treating human suffering as just the cost of doing business. He looked at her directly. I don't regret stopping that. I regret the price Marie paid for it. Those are two different things, even if it doesn't always feel that way. Emily was quiet a moment, processing his answer. And now, facing this again, knowing what it might cost you, what it might cost this town. Do you regret staying in Millbrook instead of running the moment you realized your past had found you? No, Walter said, without hesitation this time, because running never actually solves anything. It just delays the reckoning. Eventually the past catches up, one way or another. Better to face it standing somewhere I've chosen, surrounded by people I actually care about, than keep running until I'm old and alone and finally cornered with nothing left to protect. Emily crossed the kitchen and, for the first time in 2 years of working alongside him, embraced him tightly, arms wrapping around his shoulders with fierce, desperate affection. Please be careful tomorrow night, she whispered. Walter held her gently, old paternal warmth mixing with the weight of everything left unsaid between them. I'll do everything I can. That's not the same as promising you'll be okay. No, he agreed quietly. It's not, but it's the only promise I can honestly make. ***15***. The following day passed with agonizing slowness, the whole of Millbrook sitting under attention, so thick it seemed to hang visibly in the air. Federal agents maintained their discreet surveillance from unmarked positions around town. State police cruisers patrolled the main roads with deliberate visibility. And as evening approached, the iron walls began quietly positioning themselves around the diner's perimeter, their weathered faces set with grim readiness. Walter kept the diner open through the afternoon, serving the regular customers who trickled in, unaware of the storm building around them, holding on to the familiar rhythm of his ordinary life, for as long as circumstances would let him. Frank Delaney sat at his usual stall, oblivious to the tactical positioning happening just beyond the windows. You seem distracted today, Walter, he said, watching him pour coffee with slightly less precision than usual. Lot on my mind, Frank. Anything I should worrying about? Walter managed a faint, tired smile. Just go home after this. Straight home. Don't linger in town tonight. Frank studied him a moment, sensing something in Walter's tone that didn't invite more questions, and nodded slowly. All right, Walter. You take care of yourself too. By 6 that evening, Walter had closed the diner early, ushering out the last customers with careful, deliberate excuses about early maintenance work. Sheriff Reyes arrived shortly after, expression grim. Surveillance picked up unusual activity on the county line about 20 minutes ago. To vehicles, unmarked, moving in a pattern our federal friends say matches known Kessler operation signatures. How long until they reach town? Voss estimates 30 to 40 minutes, depending on route. Reyes' hand rested unconsciously on his sidearm. Walter, everyone's in position. Federal agents, state police, your old friends on their bikes. We're as ready as we're going to get. Walter nodded slowly, moving through the diner one last time, checking locks, checking positions, his mind working through the same tactical calculations he hadn't used in over 2 decades, but which apparently had never truly left him. Emily, he called toward the kitchen. It's time. Emily emerged, face pale but composed, a small overnight bag already prepared. The safe house agent Voss mentioned. State police escorts waiting 2 blocks over. Reyes confirmed. They'll take you somewhere secure till this is resolved. Emily crossed the diner floor and stopped in front of Walter, eyes searching his face with desperate intensity. Promise me you'll survive this, Emily. Promise me, she insisted, voice breaking slightly. Walter took her hands gently in his own, old and weathered against her younger, trembling fingers. "I promise I'll fight with everything I've got to see you again," he said quietly. "That's the truth. It's the only promise I can honestly give you," she nodded, tears finally spilling over despite her efforts to stay composed. And after one final, fierce embrace, allowed Ray's deputy to escort her toward the waiting state police vehicle. Glancing back at Walter one last time before disappearing into the gathering dark, Walter watched her go, something hardening behind his eyes, not coldness, but absolute, focused determination. Whatever happened tonight, he would make certain Emily and this town survived it, no matter what price his own past finally demanded. **16**. The first sign of trouble came just after 8, when the federal surveillance team stationed along the county's northern approach reported to blackish UVS, bypassing the main road entirely, cutting instead through a network of back roads that suggested detailed prior knowledge of Millbrook's layout, knowledge that shouldn't have been available to outside professionals. "They've got inside information," Voss said grimly, coordinating from a mobile command post set up discreetly behind the hardware store. "Someone's been feeding them details about the town's geography, possibly even our positioning." Ryan Cole, Walter said immediately. He's been in contact with Kessler's people. He'd know exactly where local law enforcement typically positions during operations like this. That complicates things considerably. Voss's radio crackled with updates from her surveillance teams. "They're not heading toward the diner directly. Looks like they're circling, probably trying to identify our positions before committing to an approach." Walter stood at the diner's front window, watching the darkening street beyond, every old instinct screaming with a heightened awareness he hadn't felt in 20 years. Beside him, Earl checked his weapon with practiced efficiency, his weathered face set with grim readiness. "Feels different this time," Earl said quietly. "How so?" "Back in the day, we always knew exactly who we were fighting, exactly what they wanted. This feels messier, more unpredictable." Earl glanced at Walter. "You sure you're ready for this?" "No," Walter admitted honestly. "But ready or not, they're coming." The radio crackled again, Voss's voice carrying new urgency. "We've lost visual on both vehicles. They've gone dark, probably switched to back roads without headlights. Everyone stay sharp. This could happen faster than we anticipated." Walter's hand moved instinctively toward the counter, toward the small steel box he'd placed there earlier that day, though he made no move to open it yet. Not until the moment absolutely demanded it. Minutes passed in agonizing silence, the entire town seeming to hold its breath. Every law enforcement officer, every federal agent, every aging biker positioned around Millbrook's quiet streets, straining to catch any sign of the approaching threat. Then, without warning, gunfire erupted from the eastern edge of town. "Contact," Voss's radio blared. "We have contact at the eastern perimeter, to hostiles engaging state police units." Walter's blood ran cold. "That's a diversion," he said immediately. "They're pulling resources away from the diner." Earl's expression hardened. "You think the real team's coming from a different direction?" "I'd bet everything I've got on it," as if summoned by the thought itself. The diner's back door, the one leading to the alley behind the building, exploded inward with a violent crash, wood splintering as two figures in dark tactical gear surged through the opening, weapons already raised. What followed happened in a blur of violence and chaos that investigators would later only be able to reconstruct piecemeal. Trying to understand exactly how the confrontation had unfolded, Walter moved instantly, years of dormant training snapping back with terrifying precision. Diving behind the counter as the first shot shattered glass and splintered wood across the dining room, Earl returned fire immediately, his own weapon raised with steady, practiced hands despite the decades since he'd last used one in genuine combat, forcing the two intruders to take cover behind an overturned table. "Earl," Walter shouted over the chaos, "you all right?" "I'm fine. Watch your flank." A third intruder appeared in the shattered doorway, and Walter, moving with the same fluid, controlled violence he'd shown against the Black Vipers days earlier, surged up from behind the counter and closed the distance before the man could properly aim. A brutal, efficient struggle followed, Walter's decades of buried training overriding his aging body's protests, disarming the attacker with a sharp, practiced motion before driving him backward into the wall hard enough to crack the old wood paneling. Outside, the sound of additional gunfire and shouting signaled Ray's forces, and the remaining Iron Wolves had engaged whatever threats were converging on the diner from multiple directions. The careful, coordinated defense finally proving its worth against Kessler's professional assault. But inside the diner itself, the confrontation had narrowed to something far more personal and immediate. Walter, breathing hard, blood trickling from a cut above his eyebrow, found himself facing the final attacker, a lean, cold-eyed man who'd held back from the initial assault, watching the chaos unfold with clinical detachment before finally stepping forward, a handgun raised and steady in his grip. "Walter Briggs," the man said, his voice carrying an accent that suggested origins far from Ohio. "Victor Kessler sends his regards." 20 years is a long time to wait for closure. Walter stood slowly, his own weapon lost somewhere the chaos of the fight, hands empty and raised slightly, breathing steady despite the gun pointed directly at his chest. "Then let's finish this," Walter said quietly. The man's finger tightened on the trigger, and for one suspended, terrible moment, it seemed as though 20 years of careful hiding, of quiet rebuilding, of a peaceful life built from the ashes of tragedy, was about to end in a single irreversible instant. Inside the diner Walter had spent decades calling home, but before the shot could fire, Earl's voice cut through the chaos from somewhere behind the gunman, sharp and commanding. "Drop it." The attacker's eyes flickered, just for an instant, toward the new threat, and in that fraction of a second, Walter moved. His hands shot out and closed around the gunman's wrist, driving the weapon upward. At the exact instant the trigger finally broke, the shot went wild, punching through the ceiling in a burst of plaster dust. Before the man could recover, Walter twisted the wrist sharply, feeling the joint give beneath his grip, the gun clattering to the floor as the attacker howled in pain. Earl surged forward, driving his shoulder into the man's midsection, and together they wrestled him to the ground, Earl pinning his arms while Walter, breathing hard, kicked the fallen weapon well out of reach. "You're done," Walter said, voice rough with adrenaline. "It's over." The man on the floor glared up at him, blood trickling from his nose, but something in his expression had shifted from cold professional detachment to genuine, dawning fear. "You don't understand," he gasped. "Kessler doesn't stop. Even if you take me, even if you take everyone he sent tonight, he'll just send more. He's been planning this 4 years. This isn't just about you anymore." Walter crouched down, meeting the man's eyes directly, his own gaze hard and unflinching. "What do you mean?" "It's not just about me." The man's jaw tightened, some old loyalty warring with obvious terror. But before he could answer, the diner's front door burst open and Sheriff Reyes rushed in, weapon drawn, followed closely by 2 federal agents in tactical vests, eyes sweeping the wrecked dining room with practiced efficiency. Walter, relief flooded Reyes' face at the sight of him standing wounded but alive. "You all right?" "I'm fine." Walter gestured at the man pinned beneath Earl. "He's got information. Says this isn't just about me anymore." Reyes knelt down, applying handcuffs with practiced motions, while one of the federal agents moved to secure the scene. "What's he talking about?" The man on the floor, now restrained, seemed to make a sudden calculation, weighing loyalty against self-preservation. "Self-preservation won. Kessler's not just cleaning up an old loose end," he said, voice tight with pain and fear. "He's expanding. This whole operation, the Black Vipers, the other regional crews, it's not just about protection money and drug distribution anymore. He's been laundering money through a development company, buying up distressed properties across 3 counties, planning to flip them for massive profit once the local resistance is cleared out. Your diner, this whole stretch of Route 9, it sits on land Kessler's company has been trying to acquire for over a year. Walter's expression hardened with sudden, cold understanding. This was never just about revenge. He's been using the Black Vipers to terrorize local business owners into selling cheap. The man confirmed. The old man, who owned the hardware store in Prescott, the diner in Delford, all of it. Kessler figured killing you tonight would serve two purposes: revenge for the old case, and removing the last serious obstacle to acquiring this entire corridor of property. Voss arrived moments later, expression grim as she absorbed the unfolding revelation, already reaching for her radio to relay the new information to her federal team. "This changes everything," she said. "If we can prove Kessler's development company is the financial backbone behind this entire pattern of intimidation and violence across multiple counties, we're not just looking at organized crime charges anymore. We're looking at racketeering, extortion, conspiracy, charges that could finally take this entire network apart permanently." Walter stood slowly, body aching from the fight, mind racing through the implications of what he'd just learned. 20 years of hiding, and it turned out his diner, his quiet second life, had become an obstacle standing between a criminal empire and a fortune in stolen land. "Where is Kessler now?" Walter asked. "Based on the communication patterns we've tracked," Voss said, "he's been coordinating remotely from somewhere near Cleveland, staying carefully insulated from the actual operations on the ground. That's been the problem all along. We could never get evidence tying directly back to him." "Then let's get that evidence," Walter said quietly. Tonight, ***17***, the eastern perimeter, where the initial diversionary gunfire had erupted, had already been secured by the time Walter, Earl, and Reyes made their way outside into the chaotic aftermath of the assault. Two of Kessler's professional enforcers lay wounded, but alive, overwhelmed by the coordinated response from state police and the remaining Iron Wolves. A third had tried to flee and been apprehended nearly a mile down Route 9 by a highway patrol unit Voss had positioned in anticipation of exactly this scenario. But it was the man captured attempting to flee who proved most valuable, separated from the others, isolated in the back of a federal vehicle. He broke within 20 minutes of questioning, handing Voss's team exactly what they needed: banking records, shell company documentation, and most critically, a direct communication trail linking Victor Kessler's personal cell phone to instructions for tonight's assault on Briggs Place. "It's enough," Voss said, reviewing the information on a tablet inside the mobile command post, her expression carrying the first genuine satisfaction Walter had seen from her since the whole ordeal began. "Combined with what we already had on the Black Vipers operations and the property acquisition pattern, this gives federal prosecutors everything they need for an immediate arrest warrant. You're going after him tonight?" Reyes asked. "Kessler doesn't know yet that his operation collapsed here in Millbrook. If we move fast, before word reaches him, we can execute the warrants before he has any chance to destroy evidence or disappear." Voss looked up at Walter, something like genuine gratitude softening her professional demeanor. "This is bigger than anyone anticipated when this started. Walter, you didn't just protect your diner tonight. You may have just ended a criminal network that's been terrorizing small communities across this entire region for years." Walter absorbed this quietly, the weight of it settling over him, alongside the physical exhaustion of the fight, the emotional exhaustion of finally confronting the past he'd spent 2 decades running from. "What about Ryan Cole?" he asked. "The Black Vipers are already being rounded up as we speak," Reyes confirmed, gesturing at his radio. "Once word got out that Kessler's operation collapsed, most of them scattered. But we've got enough evidence now to charge every member with racketeering, conspiracy, extortion, assault. Ryan Cole's not walking away from this a free man. Not after everything that's come to light tonight." Walter nodded slowly, and then, unable to hold back the question weighing heaviest on his mind, turned to Reyes with sudden urgency. "Emily, is she safe?" "She's safe," Reyes said quickly, catching the fear in Walter's eyes. "The safe house was never compromised. She's been waiting there the entire time, probably worried sick, but completely unharmed. Relief flooded through Walter's exhausted body, and for the first time since the assault began, he allowed himself to fully exhale, the tension finally draining from his shoulders. "I need to see her." "Give it a few more hours," Voss said gently. "We need to process the scene, secure statements, make sure everything's properly documented for the prosecution. But I promise you, Walter, by morning, this will finally be over." *18**. Dawn broke over Millbrook with a fragile, hard-won peace that felt almost surreal after the violence of the night before. Walter stood outside his diner, surveying the damage, shattered windows, a splintered back door, bullet holes marking the walls where the confrontation had unfolded, and found himself, despite everything, feeling something unexpected underneath the exhaustion. Relief, genuine, bone-deep relief. Emily arrived just after 7, practically running from the state police vehicle that had escorted her back into town, eyes searching frantically until they found Walter standing amid the wreckage of his diner, alive, exhausted, but whole. "Walter." She crossed the parking lot at a full run, and this time there was no hesitation, no careful boundary maintained between employer and employee. She threw her arms around him and held on, as though she needed physical proof that he had truly survived the night. Walter held her gently, some of the old grief that had shadowed him for 20 years, finally beginning to loosen its grip on his chest. "I told you I'd fight to see you again," he said quietly. "You scared me half to death," Emily said, pulling back just enough to look at him, taking in the cut above his eyebrow. The exhaustion etched into every line of his face. "Sheriff Reyes wouldn't tell me anything specific, just that there'd been an incident and everyone needed to stay put until it was resolved." "It's resolved," Walter said. "All of it. Kessler's operation, the Black Vipers, everything." Emily's eyes widened. "Everything, really. Agent Voss and her team executed a federal warrant early this morning," Reyes confirmed, walking up to join them, looking exhausted but deeply satisfied. "Victor Kessler was arrested at his home outside Cleveland about 2 hours ago. Between the evidence recovered here last night and what federal investigators have been building for months, they've got enough to charge him and most of his network with racketeering, conspiracy, extortion, the whole list. This isn't the kind of case that falls apart in court, Walter. This is the kind that ends careers, ends entire criminal networks, permanently." Walter absorbed the news slowly, letting it settle into the exhausted spaces of his mind, alongside everything else he'd carried through the long night. 20 years of hiding, of quiet guilt, of grief for Marie that had never fully healed. And now, finally, something that felt genuinely like closure. "And Ryan Cole?" Emily asked. "In federal custody, along with most of the Black Vipers who didn't manage to flee the county overnight," Reyes said. "He's already trying to negotiate a plea deal, apparently offering testimony against Kessler's organization in exchange for reduced charges. Not that it's going to save him from serious prison time, but it might help federal prosecutors build an even stronger case." Emily turned back to Walter, studying his face with careful attention. "How are you feeling, really?" Walter was quiet a long moment, considering the question honestly rather than deflecting the way he might have just days earlier. "Tired," he admitted, "relieved, and for the first time in 20 years. I think I might actually be free of something I've been carrying for far too long." He looked around at the damaged diner, at the community that had rallied around him through the crisis, at Earl and the other Iron Wolves who had answered his call without hesitation, despite decades of separation. "I spent so long believing I had to hide from my past to keep the people I care about safe. Turns out facing it, with the right people standing beside me, was what actually protected everyone." *19**. The weeks that followed brought a steady stream of change to Millbrook, each one chipping away at the fear and uncertainty that had gripped the town during those tense, dangerous days. Federal prosecutors moved swiftly against Kessler's network, and by early summer, Victor Kessler himself had accepted a plea deal that would keep him in federal prison for the remainder of his natural life. Unable to further terrorize small towns across 3 states with his predatory development schemes, Ryan Cole received a significantly reduced sentence in exchange for his cooperation testimony that helped federal prosecutors dismantle 3 additional regional crews operating under Kessler's umbrella in neighboring counties. It wasn't redemption, not exactly, but it was something closer to accountability than the reckless young man had seemed capable of when he'd first stormed into Walter's diner with violence in his eyes. Walter rebuilt the diner slowly, methodically, refusing offers of financial help from the town's grateful residents, insisting on doing the work himself, with only occasional help from Earl and a few of the other Iron Wolves who'd decided to stick around Millbrook a while longer, finding something in the quiet town's gratitude that reminded them why they'd once valued brotherhood and protection over fear and violence. "You know," Earl said one afternoon, helping Walter reframe the diner's newly repaired front door, "this could be a good spot for some of us to settle down. Real quiet town, decent people, not a bad way to spend whatever years we've got left." Walter glanced at his old friend, something warm and genuine crossing his weathered face. "You're welcome here, Earl, all of you. This town owes you more than it can ever properly repay." "We didn't do it for repayment," Earl said. "We did it because you're family, Walter. 20 years apart doesn't change that." The diner reopened 3 weeks after the assault, its windows freshly replaced, its walls patched and repainted. The community turned out in numbers that surprised even Walter, who'd spent 2 decades believing himself simply a quiet, unremarkable presence in the small town's daily life. Frank Delaney was there, of course, claiming his usual stall with theatrical relief. "Wasn't sure this place was going to reopen," he said, watching Walter pour coffee with steady, familiar precision. "Glad to see some things never change. Some things do, though," Walter said quietly, glancing toward Emily, who moved through the newly reopened dining room with the same easy warmth she'd always carried, though something in her had visibly grown steadier, more confident since the events of that dangerous night. "You going to tell us the whole story someday?" Frank asked. "What actually happened all those years ago? Why those men came after you the way they did?" Walter considered the question a long moment, weighing old instincts toward secrecy against the new understanding he'd gained about the cost of hiding too much from the people who genuinely cared about him. "Maybe someday," he said. "For now, just know that whatever I used to be," he gestured around the diner, at the familiar faces, the warm morning light, the community that had stood beside him through danger neither he nor they had fully anticipated. "This is who I actually chose to become, and I don't regret that choice, not for a single second." *20**6 6 months after the confrontation that had nearly cost Walter his life, a small ceremony took place on a patch of land just behind the diner, where a modest memorial garden had been established in honor of Marie Briggs, Walter's late wife, whose story he had finally, fully shared with the town that had come to care about him so deeply during the crisis that revealed his true past. Emily stood beside him during the brief ceremony, her young daughter's small hand clasped in her own, while Sheriff Reyes, Agent Voss, Earl, and dozens of Millbrook residents gathered quietly around the newly planted garden, honoring the memory of a woman most of them had never known, but whose sacrifice had ultimately shaped the quiet, principled man who had protected their town when danger came calling. "She would have loved this place," Walter said softly, looking around at the gathered community, at the small garden that finally gave him somewhere tangible to honor Marie's memory about 20 years of carrying her loss in silent, private grief. She always believed people were fundamentally good, even when the world gave her every reason to believe otherwise. "I think she'd be proud to see how this town came together. She'd be proud of you too," Emily said quietly, squeezing his hand gently, "for finally letting people in, for trusting us enough to fight alongside you instead of disappearing the way you always planned to if trouble ever found you again." Walter looked down at her daughter standing patiently beside them, at the community he'd spent 2 decades quietly serving without ever truly allowing himself to belong to it. and felt something settle deep in his chest, not the absence of grief, because Marie's loss would always remain a part of him, but something closer to peace, the understanding that surviving loss didn't mean carrying it alone forever, that protecting people didn't require hiding everything about yourself from them, that sometimes the strongest thing a person could do was let others stand beside them when the fight came. "Thank you," he said quietly, to Emily, to the town, to the memory of everything Marie's sacrifice had ultimately made possible, for giving an old man a second chance he never thought he deserved. The diner reopened fully the following week, busier than it had ever been. Word of Walter's true story spread, not as scandal or spectacle, but as something the town had come to genuinely respect. A man who had sacrificed everything once to fight against organized violence and corruption, who had rebuilt a quiet life from the ashes of tragedy, and who, when danger finally found him again, had chosen to stand and fight rather than run, protecting not just himself, but an entire community that had unknowingly depended on his quiet strength all along. After more than 20 years, Victor Kessler's criminal empire, once a shadow network stretching across 3 states, lay completely dismantled, its leadership imprisoned, its regional operations exposed and prosecuted one by one. Federal investigators used the evidence gathered that violent night in Millbrook to unravel years of extortion, intimidation, and predatory development schemes that had terrorized small towns just like this one. Ryan Cole, serving his reduced sentence in a federal facility 3 states away, would spend years reflecting on the reckless pride that had led him to underestimate a quiet diner owner who turned out to be far more than anyone in Millbrook had ever imagined. A lesson learned too late to spare him the consequences of his choices, but perhaps, in time, one that might genuinely change the man he eventually became. And Walter Briggs, standing behind the counter of his rebuilt diner on a quiet Tuesday morning, humming softly as bacon sizzled on the griddle exactly the way it always had, finally understood something he'd spent 20 years failing to accept. Some men bury their past to survive, but the strongest among them learn, eventually, that survival was never really the goal at all. What mattered was choosing, every single day afterward, exactly who you wanted to become, and having the courage to let the people who loved you stand close enough to see the whole truth of who you really were. Walter Briggs had spent 2 decades running from the man he used to be. He would spend whatever years remained to him proving, once and for all, that the man he had chosen to become was worth every single sacrifice it had taken to get there.